Hi, Professor Freeman.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Nessie Dahan. I emailed you about the project.
Yes. Hold on a second. Let me just shut my door and say one thing. So just hang on to the phone. I'll be back in 1 second, okay?
No problem.
Sorry to keep you waiting, but I'm all set now.
All right, no problem.
Okay, so how can I help you guys?
So my group's doing a documentary about the fiscal crisis of the 70s.
Yes.
So we're trying to implement various voices that would speak about the times. So would you mind if I ask you a couple of questions?
Nope, go to it.
All right. The first one's pretty general. What were the causes of the fiscal crisis in New York City?
Well, I think that's not an easy question. It's a big question, but I think there are two things. There was a growing imbalance between the revenue from taxes and other, sources and expenses, and some of that had to do with changes in the city economy in the late '60s and early 1970s, when a lot of industry moved out of the city and a lot of people moved out to the suburbs, so the tax base was diminishing. And then there was a recession, and so that further hurt the income of the city and increased the need of many people for welfare and other social services, which were expensive.
Right.
So that was happening from the late '60s on, and then with the recession in the early '70s, the situation deteriorated. But the immediate problem was that to deal with this situation, the city was borrowing more and more money, and at some point in 1974-75, the banks and the other companies that sold New York City bonds basically said, look, we're not going to lend you any more money, and in fact, you got to give us back the money that we lent you. So that debt crisis, was the immediate cause of the fiscal crisis.
Right. All right. So I looked you up, I got research, and I read that you had various books about unions.
Say that, it's hard the connection's not very good, so say that again.
I read about that you wrote several books about unions in New York City. So did these unions play any role in the atmosphere of the time? Like, were they affected, or how did they impact the crisis?
Yes, very much so, because one of the things, of course, the city was pressured to do was to cut its labor costs. So that meant laying off lots of workers and attempting to reduce wages, and so the unions became very active in trying to resist layoffs and wage cuts for their members, and eventually they began to play a big role because they allowed their pension funds to lend money to the city. So one of the ways the city got out of the crisis, when it couldn't borrow money from the banks, was to borrow money from the pension funds, and the unions had to cooperate in doing that. So they were very involved.
All right, thank you. Do you know what were the social effects of the crisis? Like, how were the people or the citizens impacted?
Yeah, well, there's a big cutback in services from the city.
Right.
And remember, this was in a bad economic recession. It was actually much worse than today. The unemployment rate was higher. There was high inflation. So people were not doing that well anyway. And then you had fewer policemen, so crime went up. You had fewer teachers, so schools were overcrowded. Things like gym classes and art classes and music classes were eliminated. The streets were literally falling apart. They didn't have enough money to pave the streets, so there were potholes every place. The garbage was picked up less often. Libraries were open less often. So, everyday life really was negatively impacted by the effects of the fiscal crisis.
Right, and this also led to the differences between the blackouts of 77 and 65, correct?
Well, I think so. It's hard to exactly prove that, but certainly when there was a much less peaceful, reaction in 77, I think everyone, concluded that in part it was a reaction to how hard life had gotten in the city, and in part as a result of the fiscal crisis. So I think that makes sense. It's not something you exactly prove, but it certainly seemed to make sense that was one of the causes of the differences.
All right. How did we recover from this crisis?
Well, in the short term, the money that was borrowed from the pension funds and some federal money that was lent on to the city helped it get over the immediate crisis. Then, of course, the national economy did eventually begin to improve by the early 1980s, so that helped the city economy begin to bounce back also. Another thing that helped, which people don't really realize, is inflation, because New York City owed a lot of money, but inflation means that the money you're paying back the loan with is worth less than the money you borrowed, in effect. So inflation has the effect of lessening the real cost of debt. So the economic recovery and inflation helped. And, of course, there were reforms in the New York City government itself. It had better budgeting practices and so forth. So, I think all these things matter, but the big difference was just the general economic recovery of the country that took place.
All right. All right, last question. What were the lasting social and economic effects of the crisis?
Well, I think the reputation of some of the public sector institutions and some of their performance never completely recovered. Just to give one example, City University was free before the fiscal crisis. Tuition was imposed directly as a result of the crisis, and of course you guys are still paying it today, so that's a kind of lasting effect. And I think the generally more negative attitude towards government services, was a holdover from the fiscal crisis. So I think that's been a factor too. And I think the general sense that the most important thing is to make a healthy business climate, as opposed to maybe providing services or welfare needs. I think that attitude's become much stronger since the fiscal crisis too. So I think the priorities have sort of changed. So even though it's a long time ago, I think you can still see some lasting effects.
All right. Speaking of CUNY, actually, do you know what the immediate effects of the shutting down of the system led to? Like, how did the people react to this?
Well, it was a huge fight because, the city and the state, particularly the state and the federal government, wanted CUNY to start imposing tuition. And actually the university tried to resist it, and they didn't really go along at first. And what the city did was effectively just gave CUNY less money and said, if you want to continue to operate, you're going to have to, have tuition. And CUNY tried to resist that, but in the end, it literally ran out of money. They had to shut down the year early, and eventually the Board of Trustees did put in tuition. So there was a lot of protest, and it wasn't just tuition either. They fired a lot of professors, classes became bigger, So there was a lot of protests, but, in the end, at least the tuition went through.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. My pleasure. Good luck with the project.
One question.
Oh, yeah.
Since it's a documentary and we're just using your voice instead of a video, is there some way to get like a picture of you to implement to the video itself?
I think I may have some really strange, weird picture that's on my computer, in which case I'm happy to email as an attachment. So let me see if I have a copy of it, and I do.
All right.
I'll do it. Either I'll do it in the next 5 minutes, or I don't have one. Okay.
All right. That's all. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you. Have a good day.
No problem. Bye.
Okay.